This is episode 127 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Now, Wally, we are going to, I don't know if you'd call it the third rail of New Mexico politics, but we're going to kind of grasp onto that third rail and really go for a fun ride today, doing a deep dive into permanent funds and the reality of what they are called around the world as sovereign wealth funds. The entree into all that, and we'll define what a sovereign wealth fund is. The entree, though, was out of this Red River confab that the Legislative Finance Committee had last week. A new permanent fund has been proposed for early childhood education. This is August 28th, Santa Fe, New Mexican, Jens Erik Gould, which almost strikes me as a Norwegian name, and I'll more on that in a second. But there is a conversation, at least, about adding another permanent fund to New Mexico's mix of already significant sovereign wealth funds. Before I, get into this and bring you into the discussion, it is important to define your terms. And a sovereign wealth fund, this is one of those things where Wikipedia does have a great deal of utility. A sovereign wealth fund is a state-owned investment fund that invests in real and financial assets such as stocks, bonds, real estate, precious metals, or in alternative investments such as private equity or hedge funds. So that is what a sovereign wealth fund is. And New Mexico, if you go further down that page, we do have one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the entire globe. So comparing us against nations, we're in the top 40. I think we're 39th. And our sovereign wealth fund in New Mexico trails only a couple in Texas, as well as one out of Alaska. And the reason I kind of talked about the Mr. Jens Erik's name is because Norway has the largest sovereign wealth fund in the entire world. People don't think of Norway as a big oil producing state, but it is. And their permanent, their sovereign wealth fund, which is what a permanent fund is the biggest on the globe, followed by China, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia. Those are the top ones, as you can imagine. Oil. And Hong Kong does have one. Then China again, Singapore, Qatar, Canada, and then China again. So there's multiple often sovereign wealth funds within a single nation state.
Yeah, and it's interesting. There's no requirement that sovereign wealth funds be funded from taxes and other revenues from oil and gas. It just seems like that's the overwhelming majority of what happens, including here in New Mexico.
And it kind of makes sense. You have a lot of money, volatile sources in terms of oil and gas. It's kind of this creature almost that can be outside of your overall economy. And in the case of New Mexico, we're seeing that writ large with the Permian Basin, where you have sudden flows of enormous amounts of money coming into New Mexico. And how do you address that issue? How do you solve what is a beneficial problem to have ultimately, but where do you put all of those dollars? And we've got some ideas. A permanent fund, well, so do the politicians in Santa Fe. A permanent fund isn't necessarily our bailiwick, but our desire for one of these new locations to stash some of this oil money. But we've got funds in place, and they are already significant recipients, significant factors in New Mexico. So I'm going to go through and feel free to jump in on any of these, Wally. The major fund we have in New Mexico is the Land Grant Permanent Fund. approximately $18 billion. In fiscal year 2020, this fund provided $784.2 million to New Mexico's public schools, universities, and other beneficiaries. Those include the School for the Blind, Schools for the Deaf, Colfax Medical Center. Those are all recipients, but the biggest single one by far is the public schools, trailed by universities and then a lot of different other institutions. So 80% of that money goes directly into K-12. That's a lot of money flowing into these schools. Surprisingly, though, Wally, we don't have a top-performing K-12 system. I know it's shocking. You would think with essentially a huge infusion of free money that we would be doing better.
Yeah,
maybe not.
A Harvard University-like endowment, not creating necessarily Harvard University-like academic achievement, but I'm not sure that's a fair analysis. But one of the things to note about the Land Grant Permanent Fund is it is allocated to a group of distinct beneficiaries, and but the biggest are the K through 12 schools and the universities in New Mexico. And the way it works out, with very few exceptions, is the amount of money that the state gives those institutions has tended to be more than this directly allocated amount that comes from the Land Grant Permanent Fund. Another way of saying it is they haven't been getting more than they would have otherwise. Actually, the legislature has to make up funds from other places for things like K through 12. But an interesting issue to me is what happens if oil keeps going great guns and these funds get to the part where we're going to be giving higher education more directly from the Land Grant Permanent Fund than the legislature would like to do otherwise. Then what happens? Then you create this whole weird inefficiency. And that already happens with a couple of named beneficiaries. But again, it's not even worth talking about conceptually because most of the funds do go to K through 12 and universities in New Mexico.
Well, we're going to talk about accountability because I think that is a critical component of this entire issue and why these funds are not necessarily a great option for governance and governmental performance. But we're going to move on to the Severance Tax Permanent Fund. And, you know, the Land Grant Permanent Fund is the big kahuna. This one is the second in command kahuna, if you will, $5 billion. This fund is mostly for paying down debt on public works projects, so paying off those bonds and interest on roads, say if the state of New Mexico were to give the city of Albuquerque money to rehabilitate, refurbish the old rail yard facility down there, that $50 to $80 million that the city's looking for, this is where the Board of Finance would come in and dole out some money from the Severance Tax Permanent Fund.
And the way that this works is the amounts, and I know more about this than I should, so I don't want anyone's head to explode in boredom out there, but the severance taxes come in and the amounts that aren't scraped away for bonding, and you're very correct that the funds are there for bonding, but if they're scraped away for bonding, they issue bonds, which is basically government issuing debt with promises. If those funds aren't scraped away for bonding, then they go to the permanent fund. Not that many years ago, before Governor Richardson took over, the funds would be split between, we're going to use about half those funds for bonding and about half into the permanent fund. Well, building the Big I, the spaceport, and other projects, it got to be where this permanent fund got a very short shrift of this investment, and most of it was just bonded, spent very quickly, and that's why that fund hasn't grown as much as it could. So it's one of those little refinements. But when I was studying this, it was interesting. The question would come up: why doesn't the severance tax fund grow like the land grant fund? And the answer is, a lot of the money wasn't ever getting there. Having said that, there's $5 billion there, nothing to sneeze at, and more could be put in with different public policy from the legislature.
Well, and with the price of oil and the production of oil that we're seeing, likely not just the severance tax permanent fund, but also the land grant permanent fund are going to see some sustained growth at least for a few years, possibly for several years ahead. And again, the Board of Finance, you go up, and I've been there, and it's a real interesting thing. You don't, maybe other states have similar things, but you get municipalities, you get counties, you get like water control agencies. So a MAFCA, the one here locally that manages the ditches and whatnot, they say we have a need for X, Y, and Z. And so this Board of Finance, the governor sits at the chair, but good luck. Most people have no idea who sits on the Board of Finance. Finding the meeting, if you even choose to go on, it's like a round table up in the governor's office. And for this group of people to have such power over such a large pot of money, it's a really concerning system, the way that it works out. But we'll, again, further discussion about transparency and accountability there. We've got other permanent funds in the state of New Mexico. There are, let's see, the Revenue Stabilization Reserve. That's kind of the one that they talk about each session is we're going to put money aside to make sure that next year, we saw this, we dipped into this a lot during the downturn 2008, 2009. There's a Tobacco Settlement Permanent Fund. This is out of the federal government's lawsuit against the tobacco companies. And so there's money that's in there that theoretically is supposed to be used for educating people against tobacco use. I haven't seen a lot of those commercials on TV recently.
Well, and this is a good example about how these funds, you have almost your nameplate use. And that Tobacco Settlement Fund, we're going to use that against smoking. They've rated that thing and they've pulled money out of that thing to where it's just a small fraction of what it would have been if it were operated even like the Land Grant Permanent Fund. And then, it all sounds so good to designate. It's almost like, okay, this is dirty tobacco money, so the money has to be used for dirty tobacco activities. Really, why is that good? Are we that simple that everything has to be this one-for-one relationship? And like, if the state of New Mexico gets money, can't even the legislature take an objective look at what the best and highest use of that money would be from a fiscal point of view?
Yeah, they may have decided to allocate some of that tobacco fund to healthier alternatives to smoking, like vaping, when in fact the legislature this session imposed significant taxes on vaping instead. Yeah, so sometimes with these things, you never know. The right hand and the left hand don't know what each other are doing. Real quickly, there's also a water trust fund and a rural libraries fund. So we have a number of these funds around the state. And like I said, there's at least being considered, and considered enough that Senate Finance Committee, John Arthur Smith, has said that he thinks it's a good idea. Yet another permanent fund for the state of New Mexico. So we're going to start kind of at the top here and work our way down through some of the issues with permanent funds. The biggest problem that I personally have, and I think anyone who considers themselves a free market capitalist should have with these funds, is that it is socialism. It is the purest form of socialism to have the government, whatever government that may be, in charge of collecting money, taxing money away from private business, and then investing, quote unquote, that money. But at least in this case, they are investing in terms of stocks and bonds, but controlling through ownership of these companies, at least partially owning them, what happens in the private sector. It's just really frightening, I think. And we've seen this back to the tobacco issue. I believe California, but numerous sovereign wealth funds and pension plans have said, well, we're not going to invest in X, or, tobacco being a prominent one.
Oil and gas is one that's out there huge.
would be really ironic if you have this huge pot of money from oil and gas that then you won't invest in oil and gas. But I don't think that's happened. And to be fair, we haven't had the political situation like that in New Mexico where they've stopped investing in X, Y, or Z business on so-called moral reasons. But we've had other issues with the permanent funds and investing those. But we'll get into that in a few minutes. But just the idea, and maybe we trust our governments here in New Mexico, in the United States, New Mexico, whatever, but the Chinese government sitting on the second biggest sovereign wealth funds on the globe, do you really trust the Chinese to not try to manipulate the free market of whether it's the United States or other nations? It seems that this is a real problem, Wally.
Yeah, and this brings up you bring up an interesting point that has its own level of complexity. You could argue, like, for the state of New Mexico, what is the proper point at which to manage your risk and try to do as good as you can with money without putting it unduly at risk? You could argue that because so much of the money coming in is from oil and gas, you don't want to invest any of that in oil and gas because you have a downturn. But then it's like, okay, so then are you biting, are you biting the hand that feeds you, or is that actually the right thing to do from a economic management point of view? But the problem with these wealth funds and how the investments, if it were only so clear, is just a risk management. It tends to become this highly politicized process over time where basically the favorites get invested in and those that are a little bit less in vogue get eliminated. And then maybe on the debt side, investing in bonds, that's not as important. But when you talk about investing in equity stocks, the most valuable, but the highest potential for return long term, but also the ability to just shut complete industries out. What if every government everywhere said we're not going to invest in something? There you have it. It's going to be very difficult for that industry to raise capital. And in fact, that is the stated objective of a lot of the keep it in the ground initiatives that are out there right now, as they try to pressure retirement funds, pension funds to not invest in oil and gas, thereby starving them of the capital they need to grow the business and keep it going.
Yeah, gun manufacturers being another
great example. Yes,
and look, it is problematic to have keep it in the grounders and others making these kinds of investment decisions. But on the other hand, as individuals here, as people who are residents of New Mexico or any other state that has a sovereign wealth fund, it is kind of troubling, I do think, in a reasonable basis to have money invested on your behalf in enterprises that you have staunch moral opinions about. Say someone who's a member of the Latter-day Saints Church or even the Catholic Church, on gambling or alcohol or marijuana businesses now are becoming a bigger deal. Do we really want our tax dollars, if you will, invested in those ways? Now, that is one aspect, and I'll just kind of put that off to the side because we have a lot more to plow through.
There is something to offend everyone in this podcast,
exactly.
if I'm not mistaken. So.
I think the second issue we come to is how is this money invested, whether it's, and we talked about this briefly off the air, but is this money invested in New Mexico for the benefit of New Mexico businesses, private equity, companies getting started? On the flip side of that, then when you have the State Investment Council, as they did, it's getting on towards 10 years ago, when the State Investment Council became a target of investigations by none other than the Rio Grande Foundation and others for blowing through a lot of money that they were supposed to be investing in these startup companies here in New Mexico. That's a very small component, a portion of, let's see, it was not the sorry, I get these mixed up, but the land grant, this was the land grant permanent fund, a part of that was used to invest in New Mexico companies that were hopefully going to do business here, create jobs. And yeah, you talk to a venture capitalist and they say, you invest $1 million in 100 different companies. You're lucky if one of those pans out into a really long-term viable concern. But is this the kind of thing we want government doing on our behalf? And should we be investing it all in New Mexico businesses, or should we be investing it where we can get the best rate of return? And Wally, these are questions that have no answers, so I'll just throw it to you.
Well, I will say that largely for me, they have an answer, and let me explain why. So let's set aside these small venture capital investments for a while in New Mexico companies, and just let's go to where the bulk of those, what sort of instruments could you invest billions of dollars in? And it's going to have to be some sort of corporate debt or some sort of government debt, whether it be federal government, or some sort of corporate equity, stocks and bonds. Well, we have you did a show, five public traded companies in New Mexico, of which only one public service company in New Mexico has any sort of scale at all. The others are very, very, very small. So we're not a huge corporate public sort of finance mecca in terms of what we are. I think it would be next to impossible to effectively, efficiently, and safely invest anywhere near our permanent funds here in New Mexico. So then because of that, and again, New Mexico didn't do anything, evil to get in this situation. It's just a fact. Therefore, the benefit we get from that investment is only the investment return. Most of the economic activity that is encouraging or supportive or whatever, by definition, is elsewhere. But I think to overcome that would be a cure worse than the disease.
Yeah, basically the point is that New Mexico is a small state, a little over 2 million people. We have just 3 publicly traded companies. We're not California or Ohio even.
Or New York,
where you could put that money to work right here in your state. Now, of course, say you're in Ohio, and I'll just mention because I know some of the publicly traded companies in my hometown, Procter & Gamble. Procter & Gamble is going to invest on a worldwide basis,
yes,
as are these corporations. But on the other hand, their international headquarters are there in Ohio. So if you were to invest in them, you do know that some of that is coming back home for your benefit.
Well, and taking that idea and turning it inside out, by proxy, about the only way to invest huge sums of money directly in New Mexico would be to invest in the oil and gas industry in companies like ExxonMobil, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, those others that have huge positions in the New Mexico side of the Permian Basin. And so then, but then to do that, what have you really done? You've concentrated your risk beyond what's probably advisable, and maybe you've created more problems than you've actually solved.
Yeah, basically for the same reason as you don't want to necessarily hold on to all of your stock options if you're working for Corporation X, because if you were to, say, lose your job, or the economy were to take a header, the stock of that company were to take a header, then you would be fully invested, not just your career, but your funds available would be detrimentally affected by that kind of downturn with that particular company. Whereas if you at least invest it in other businesses, you might have some that do well while others do poorly. So point well taken there, Wally. In New Mexico, you might not want to invest a lot of these permanent fund revenues in oil and gas for the simple fact that they were already created by that industry, which does make life difficult for these guys investing those funds. We've got a lot more to talk about still on these permanent funds. They are very complicated. And, kind of what you're picking up if you're listening to this is that we at the Rio Grande Foundation do not necessarily share what I would broadly consider the conservative or the right perspective in New Mexico that these funds are sacrosanct, that we should never tap them, that we should keep them and expand them. And that's not necessarily a perspective, expanding them, that is popular on the right. Although John Arthur Smith, for all intents and purposes, is often considered to be on the right in New Mexico, but I don't think that's an accurate statement. Rod Montoya, a state representative from Farmington, in the article I saw in the discussion, because he's on the LFC, he raised some red flags about starting a new permanent fund. But we should have these conversations about all permanent funds. What is the best way to use these pots of money? And one of the issues, Wally, and for better or for worse, it is a real challenge to gain access to these funds. These are very strictly protected in New Mexico's constitution. So just to change the withdrawal rate or alter some part of New Mexico's permanent funds, the legislature must pass a joint resolution. That's essentially a constitutional amendment, meaning that the governor does not have a say. So whether Susana Martinez supported or opposed tapping the fund for preschool was largely irrelevant. She, I'm sure, helped kind of shore up opposition among Republicans, but I think Republicans were pretty universal in their opposition. But Michelle Lujan Grisham's support of said policy really is immaterial as well. Then you have a vote of the people because it's like a constitutional amendment. And then the kicker, you have to get approval from Congress to change the distribution rate. And this
at least in the land grant permanent fund, because that was established by Congress. Now this new one, probably not, but yes. In the land grant, you are absolutely correct. Yeah, that was established with statehood, shortly thereafter, and so there are a lot of issues. And what this strikes me is that if you look at the Constitution of the United States for a model, taxation and fiscal items are supposed to originate in the House of Representatives because that's the one that's supposedly closest to the people and most flexible. Well, this, and again, using the state constitution as a model, is the polar opposite. This is the furthest from the people at all possible. It's set up by something that goes back to the early 1900s. It's very inflexible. Having said that, it has served the state. It's not been a big disaster for the state, but go ahead and put another 10, 20, 30, $50 billion in there, and possibly that land grant permanent fund may be putting money the wrong place, make it very difficult to get it to the right place for our state.
Exactly. And having congressional approval of one of the funds, that makes things more difficult. Of course, it makes the mission of the left, which wants to get a hold of the land grant permanent fund to use for new pre-K spending, it makes that all the more difficult. So there's pluses and minuses, but basically the point is that you don't have this concept of we're in a tough economic spot, so we're just going to tap this money. You have a lot of roadblocks, a lot of challenges to get to these funds.
Well, and that brings up and Paul, that brings up a good point is that sometimes these are called rainy day funds. These are not rainy day funds. You alluded to, there is a quote rainy day revenue stabilization where they keep reserves in case revenues are down a little bit. That is not the land grant permanent and severance tax permanent fund. These are designed to be operated into perpetuity.
Now, let's talk about accountability here, because there are a number of smaller funds, schools for the blind and deaf, et cetera. And you have this money flowing into them, millions of dollars, relatively unaccountable, certainly unaccountable to the taxpayers. And I think it's kind of been, taking a step back, it's kind of been understood on the left and the right. When Bono gets something, the singer from U2,
yes,
we all kind of need to understand that this is making its way into the popular viewpoint. Now, Bono is mostly known for his advocacy on foreign aid, and at one time he was, essentially pro-foreign aid from the United States to poorer countries, predominantly in Africa. Why does that make sense? Why is this metaphor real? Well, these are dollars in these funds, these permanent funds that come into our state kind of without much accountability. When you're getting, even if it's 1% of the dollars from the land grant permanent fund, that is a lot of money. Do you have an incentive to change the way you do business, to create efficiencies, to manage those dollars effectively when you have very little oversight? The public barely knows that there's a school of the blind or a school for the deaf, let alone the Colfax Medical Center. And you might have a board that has some say, but when the money is constitutionally there, it is coming whether you want it or not, whether you like it or not, whether you think you can use it or not. This is not a great way to do business, Wally.
Well, and early in my career, when I was a certified public accountant at a very low level, I got to work on quite a few high net wealth families. And it's this endowment effect is sometimes you get these kids, they're called trust fund babies. They know they're going to get this money no matter what they do. They don't have an incentive to always do the right things. And what happened is, and just to cut it short, is a partner explained to me he'd seen a lot of these trust fund kids that came into money, and he said the money seldom changes the direction of their life; it just accelerates it. So if they're going bad and they get these big trust fund distributions, it makes their bad life happen quicker. Well, in the case of New Mexico, if we're investing in mediocrity and we know the level of investment is going to be the same no matter what, are we encouraging mediocrity? I think is your point. And this is a very, very interesting question.
Yeah. Imagine all the people out there who have those trust funds and how many challenges, not challenges per se, but things that they often do to themselves.
Maserati and cocaine are usually we're involved literally in a couple cases I was
exactly.
on.
And this is government we're talking about, which is already, much less accountable for its own actions than an individual. At least an individual will suffer the consequences of the Maserati and cocaine lifestyle, which may sound like a lot of fun to a lot of people, but and I'm not saying that those kinds of activities are happening at some of these endowed entities throughout New Mexico, but we don't know because there is very little transparency or accountability associated with any of these institutions.
Yeah, and it's back to the thing in public policy, you don't always get what you want, you get what you incentivize. And do these permanent funds create some unhealthy incentives for the groups that are getting the fund? It's a very valid question.
So
what should we do with the money?
Well, that's exactly. I'm trying to get to that point. This is one of those things where you have a long backstory here because it's very complicated stuff. Well, Alaska does things a little different when it comes to its permanent fund, and I was reading through some of the Alaska permanent funds materials and found that over the last decade, that fund has given a dividend of a little over $1,000, $1,213 annually. This is on average over the decade per individual, or about $4,800 for a family of four. Now, we have this money. Definitely, I think, Wally, from a free market perspective, from a what should we do with this money perspective, returning these dollars, whether it's in the form of a new permanent fund that then spends off money in the form of a dividend to average New Mexicans, or some other mechanism for returning that money. Yes, you can argue that you're giving an entitlement to average New Mexicans through this program. But imagine you're a young kid and you have received a little over $1,000 a year for 10 years. So you're 10 years old and suddenly you've got $15,000. Now, good parents will say, save that money for school or do something worthwhile with that, invest it. You probably will have more than $15,000 in that case, and you can use it to really build your life into the future. So I would say that as a realistic model, this is the best option for New Mexico. There's some things that we're going to talk about that may not entirely be politically realistic, but this is the one that I think makes the most sense to return a vast majority of this new wealth from the oil and gas industry to average New Mexicans.
Well, and one of the things it seems to me about the Alaska Fund is Alaska is a tough place to keep population, to keep an economy going, and this is an incentive to do that. And it provides an incentive for people to stay there. Well, if you look at New Mexico over the past decade, we have not grown. It's not like if we were in a situation like Colorado or Arizona, Texas, where our population was skyrocketing, the advisability of something like this, you might have to take that population growth into account much more. Where we are now, this could make a whole lot of sense in New Mexico.
You got it. And one of the things I really like in Alaska, and now I've been there, as we had on the podcast over a year ago, I discussed my experiences in Alaska. And I think another side benefit of returning those dollars to New Mexicans is that you build political support throughout the entire state for this industry, which does so much to fund all aspects of state, not just government, but our state's economy. Average Alaskans get it when you talk about their oil production and the impact it has on their economy, their day-to-day lives. I mentioned a specific experience in a bike store where the guy said, tourism's great, but we really need to get oil production going in in Alaska. And they have issues, just their fields that exist have been depleted. That's why Trump was so set on, the tax cut bill was also included accessing the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge, because if you don't keep the pressure going on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, you lose that as a usable resource. And that really crushes Alaska's economy. So Alaskans are very supportive of this industry that keeps them going and provides a nice little endowment for all Alaskans every single year, but most notably young people who can live 15 years of their lives and have a nice, tidy amount of savings. It's a heck of a lot better than your piggy bank at home for my kids.
No, absolutely. And then, just to put this into perspective, it would take a while to build up a fund, but, we talked on the podcast before that the state of New Mexico will probably have another $1 billion with a B dollar of funds that need to be allocated by the legislature. If they were to take and allocate that to giving it to every man, woman, and child in New Mexico, that's roughly $500 per person, about $2,000 for the proverbial family of four. That could be possible in this coming year. That is well within the means of the legislature to do something like that. And then what would that mean if every family in New Mexico had an average of $2,000 of disposable income? We talked a little earlier about what do you invest in? Well, to the extent that any of that money would be used to pay off credit card debts, that's money that's going out the door to elsewhere at 18, 25, even higher percent. It could be a big positive for the economy of the state to do something like that. I think more than most people are even willing to hypothesize, because it seems like, oh no, we could never give the people's money back to the people. That's just too hard to even contemplate.
Yeah, and it is worth noting Alaska is a conservative red state, but you look online, you look at articles about it, and the Alaska model is one of those things that has a decent amount of support from the left and the right, because one of the big concepts that's caught some attention in the Democratic presidential primary is a universal basic income. Well, this kind of permanent fund distribution setup where you're doing it for every individual is pretty darn close to that concept of a universal basic income. You still got the traditional welfare programs and everything and whatnot, but you've got a little baseline of money available to every single Alaskan. And that is something that it should at least be considered here before we go down the path of another permanent fund. Now, Wally, we're going to get into far out territory here as the final minutes wane in our show. And it's, of course, worth noting that these funds, by their nature, are nothing more than deferred spending. So it's great that we have some money to spend, but it's only how we use that money that affects whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. And it can be bad, as you talked about, the entitlement mentality of these trust fund babies. Not all of them, but certainly it's something that is in popular culture that folks who come out of the womb with billions of dollars to their name, parenting them is often a great challenge, and getting them to be motivated and try to be successful. And I think the same can be said for New Mexico state government. There's an entitlement mentality at work in our legislature. Now, that being said, it's probably not going to happen anytime in the near future, but not just the current surplus, but going back into other permanent funds. It would be amazing if we dedicated more of this money that is now sitting, waiting to be spent, being invested by the government of the state of New Mexico, and instead did something right away to address New Mexico's economy. Say, eliminating the personal income tax, reform the gross receipts tax, pay down our pension debts. Any or all of these things could be components of what we do. Now, there's obstacles inherent. You've got to get through the legislature. You've got to get through a vote of the people. You've got to get through Congress in the case of a couple of our permanent funds. But this money, really, we have an opportunity to change New Mexico for the better. There's no reason that we should, aside from the challenge, be keeping all of these funds on the sidelines and just waiting to pump them into government bodies, whether they need them or not, whether they do a good job. I mean, K-12, we know they don't do a particularly good job. And I think at least a part of that is that a lot of the money that they receive is not accountable to the people of the state of New Mexico. It is money that they know they're going to get every year, whether they do a good job or not.
Yeah, I think that point is well taken. And then the other, not to overly complicate it, but the other concept that New Mexico has some similarities with is the idea that many oil-producing countries have the money creates such corruption and damages, the Nigerian impact, for example. Now, I'm not comparing to anyone. Wally Drangemeister did not compare New Mexico to Nigeria. The point is that these funds, not well managed, can create problems. In Arizona, if the legislature is going to do something that is generally bad for business, because free market business is such a big part of their economy, that will be felt both politically and practically across the entire state. New Mexico has this industry that has a little bit different economics and has this little bit different flow stream, so that maybe we can do a few things, never allow right to work, make onerous high minimum wage rates even for rural New Mexico, because, it may hurt the people involved, but it's not going to hurt state government because a lot of that's coming from elsewhere.
Well, we may not be Nigeria, but we're not Norway either. And keeping with the in theme, Norway, New Mexico, Nigeria. It's just a question of where on that spectrum of in-oriented countries and states are we. It's certainly worth noting that New Mexico is known within the United States for its corruption. It would be amazing if we got something as radical, if you will, as a zero income tax. But it's worth noting that Alaska not only gives you a rebate on your money, but they don't charge you a personal income tax or a sales tax when you go to Alaska. And we are a bigger oil producing state now than Alaska is. We're third in the country. I think Alaska is down to like 7 or 8, partially due to this recent declining production of oil up in Alaska. So my point is, whether we do something about these permanent funds or not, we have a real opportunity to reform New Mexico, to improve its competitiveness, to diversify its economy. The gross receipts tax is kind of the baseline. If we go 2, 3, 4, 5 years into this boom and it's still anything like a boom, and we haven't done significant work to address the gross receipts tax, it is an absolute abject failure, and this state is in dire trouble moving forward. It would be wise and not unrealistic to consider eliminating the personal income tax. Our neighbors to the east, Texas, they have no income tax, but it's not just oil-rich states. Florida has no income tax. Wyoming has no income tax. Nevada has no income tax. South Dakota as well. New Hampshire, also no sales or income tax in the Granite State. So there's a lot of states we should consider emulating as beacons of freedom for not taxing productive activity. And if we know anything about New Mexico and New Mexicans, we need to incentivize as many of them to work as possible. We have low workforce participation rates. We have a lot of social ills. Idle hands are the devil's workshop, and we need people working in the state of New Mexico, coming here, building businesses, building private sector economic activity, not waiting around for money to filter through the government that is unfortunately not working as well to the citizens' benefit as one might be led to believe.
Yeah, absolutely. And all very good points. Actually, I think it would be easier to get rid of the income tax in New Mexico than it would be to reform the gross receipts tax. I think for long-term economic success of the state, that gross receipts tax, that is the millstone around the state of New Mexico for long-term economic growth and prosperity. And, I'm very hopeful that if not this session, as you say, sometime during this boom cycle that we're in, that we take some steps to reform that in a positive way, because it's very possible that this could be, once in a generation, once in a lifetime opportunity. Things have come together right now that would allow that to happen. That, not saying they never would, they could happen again many times, but this is the best opportunity in my lifetime, I think, to do this. And the gross receipts tax has certainly morphed into an even more horrible taxation form than it was just 5-6 short years ago.
Yeah, and just as a reminder, folks, we are just kind of getting into this entire situation. We saw a doubling of production in oil in New Mexico between 2012 and 2018, or tripling, I'm sorry. It's supposed to double again between 2018 and 2021. So we have this opportunity. It's imperative that our political leadership does not screw this up. Thank you for listening to this week's podcast. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter. Tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.